The decision we have long been awaiting has now been released by Judge Arthur Engoron. This, of course, coming out of New York. How would the fraud case end? Quite the trial, quite the situation. How would it conclude? And how devastated would Trump be? Well, we now have answers to those questions. Trump and his business have been ordered to pay $355 million. Trump is banned from doing business in New York for 3 years. His sons have been fined $4 million each for their engagement in fraud and are also barred for 2 years from business in New York. Quickly from the New York Times, then I'll bring in our legal expert. A New York judge on Friday handed Donald J. Trump a crushing defeat in his civil fraud case, finding the former president liable for conspiring to manipulate his net worth and ordering him to pay a penalty of $355 million that could wipe out his entire stockpile of cash. Just music to my ears. To break this down, I want to bring in our legal expert, Aaron Parnas. Wow. What's your initial response to this breaking news, Aaron?
It's a pretty wild day. I don't think I ever really thought that this day would come, even though we saw the craziness of Alina Habba and that trial. But I think this is really going to put Donald Trump's quote-unquote billionaire net worth to the test. We saw that Donald Trump previously was reported that he only had about $450 million in cash on hand. And with this $350 million judgment coupled with the $83 million judgment with E. Jean Carroll, and then the other $5 million judgment that he already technically paid, I mean, I just don't see how he's going to afford all of it.
And let me read some of Alina Habba's response. You mentioned her. It is the culmination, she says, of a multi-year politically fueled witch hunt that was designed to take down Donald Trump. Yeah, maybe that, or maybe Trump engaged in fraud and our legal system is playing out how it should. So with this big number, $355 million, you're talking about how much money Trump has on hand. This plus the other big $83.3 million case, this is getting out of his control, or out of control for him, I should say. When it comes to this, because it says him and his businesses, can they share the burden there?
Yeah, 100%. So the judgment is that he is jointly and severally liable with his business entities. And there's about 120 million that he's liable with, like the Trump Organization, another 120 million that he's liable jointly and severally with some other entities, and then 60 million with some other entities. Anyways, what that means jointly and severally is that the entities, all the defendants, could essentially share the judgment. They could all contribute to it. So that is his one saving grace. Theoretically, if he is forced to pay this judgment after appeal, the Trump Organization could merely foot the bill for the entire judgment, and he himself would never have to pay out of pocket. It's $350 million total amongst all of these entities, and they can choose kind of how they pay. Typically, what you would see in just regular cases when you have there are different types of fault. You have joint and several liability. You have comparative liability. Comparative liability would be the jury saying, oh, Donald Trump's 80% at fault and the entity's at 20%. So you share the judgment at an 80-20 split. Here, joint and several means that they all share. They're all liable for the 350, and they're just going to have to figure it out themselves how to pay for it.
And I do want to note that $370 million was what Letitia James asked for. So essentially, he went with her top line number, which is pretty significant, right? Normally, they would come in a little low.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I think it was a significant judgment. I think this was meant to send a message to Donald Trump and the Trump Organization. I do think it is interesting, though, that I remember Letitia James actually asked for a permanent bar of Donald Trump from the industry, but this judgment actually only bars him for 3 years. Donald Trump is elderly. I don't see him going back into business and serving as a director of a company in the next few years anyway. So that was an interesting part of the ruling, but it's not surprising that Judge Engoron went with Letitia James's number, given the fact that the evidence presented at trial didn't really rebut any of the evidence she put forth. It was pretty evident that Donald Trump and the Trump Organization, they were liable for the actions alleged by the New York Attorney General's office.
So remind the audience, I touched on it very briefly in the introduction, but remind the audience what it is that Trump did.
Yeah, so essentially he conspired. The allegation was that he defrauded the state of New York by conspiring to overinflate his assets. He lied to banks and other organizations to take out loans, to pay for certain assets. He just made a lot of misrepresentations to the state of New York. That's the basic kind of crux of the case. The reason why the judgment is just so big is because he did it at such a massive scale, and the state suffered such massive damages that he is now forced to pay this amount. Your average person isn't on the hook for a $350 million judgment, because your average person, even if they make a misrepresentation to a state entity, that misrepresentation does not cost the state this amount of money. So I think that's where you kind of see the disparity.
And you could tell that this case really got under his skin. His outside of court rants were each one more deranged than the previous. And he had that very strange, just sort of, now that we're at the end, Aaron, I'm just sort of reflecting on the experience of this trial. He would do this strange thing where it seemed every time he showed up to court, well, two things would happen. The first would be him saying that he has to be there and he should be campaigning when he wasn't actually required to be there. The second was him increasing how much he said Mar-a-Lago was worth, like every single time. It's 100 times what they say that it is. It's $1 billion property.
The judge is wrong in his ruling. He valued Mar-a-Lago at $18 million, and it's worth $1 billion, maybe $1.5 billion. And you saw where various properties that we have that are valued in the financial statements, which is totally subject to the clause that you've all been hearing about doing buyer beware, as they call it. And this rogue judge, a Trump hater, the only one that hates Trump more is his associate up there, his person that works with him. And she's screaming into his ear on almost every time we ask a question. It's a disgrace. You want to know the truth? It's a disgrace.
Very strange. Any last takeaways before we wrap up on this, Aaron?
I mean, I think the takeaway is that really this is just the beginning for Trump. I mean, you saw E. Jean Carroll. That hurt him. This is going to hurt him even more. But now he has criminal trials coming up, which could end him. So I really think this is the beginning of what is going to be a very long year in the courtroom for Donald Trump.
That should send chills down Trump's spine. Aaron, where can people find you?
On all my social media platforms, just at Aaron Parnas.